Picture this. You're a 16-year-old prince, heir to one of the most powerful empires in the world. Your entire life has been mapped out for you. The tutors who would shape your mind, the advisors who would guide your reign, the armies you would one day command. But there's one decision you thought would be yours alone. Who you would marry, who you would love, who would stand beside you as you ruled an empire. Then, one morning, you're summoned to the throne room, where your aunt, the woman who raised you, who controlled every aspect of your life, announces that you will marry her niece, your first cousin, your aunt's daughter, the girl you grew up calling sister. You feel the blood drain from your face as the reality sinks in. This isn't a suggestion or a political proposal to be negotiated. This is an imperial decree, as unchangeable as the rising sun. Your aunt's eyes gleam with satisfaction as she watches your world collapse. She has found the perfect way to ensure her power will never fade, by forcing you to marry into her own bloodline, guaranteeing that her family's influence will stretch across generations. You are no longer a prince with a future. You are a pawn in a game you never knew you were playing. This nightmare wasn't fiction for countless young royals throughout history. It was their devastating reality, and the stories of what happened to them will haunt you long after you finish listening. Before diving into these forgotten tales of political manipulation and human suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these dark chapters of history together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the past. To understand how princes could be forced into such marriages, we need to grasp the twisted logic that made these unions not just acceptable, but politically essential. For centuries, royal families across the globe operated according to a simple but brutal principle: bloodline purity equaled political legitimacy. They believed that marrying within their own families would preserve their divine right to rule, keeping their sacred bloodlines free from contamination by lesser nobles or, heaven forbid, commoners. This wasn't just tradition. It was the foundation of their entire political system. When you married your aunt, your niece, or your cousin, you weren't just choosing a spouse. You were making a statement about your family's superiority, their God-given right to rule over millions of subjects. The genetic consequences were irrelevant because the political benefits seemed so obvious. Keep the bloodline pure, keep the power concentrated, keep the dynasty strong. But what they created wasn't strength. It was a genetic and psychological nightmare that would destroy empires and shatter countless lives. The most documented and perhaps most tragic example of this system comes from the Chinese imperial court, where a young emperor named Guangxu found himself trapped in exactly this scenario. Born in 1871, Guangxu wasn't supposed to rule. He was living a relatively peaceful life as a prince when his cousin, the Tongji emperor, died suddenly without an heir. The powerful Empress Dowager Cixi, who had been the real power behind the throne for decades, needed a new puppet emperor. She chose her nephew, young Guangxu, not because he was qualified, but because she could control him completely. At just 4 years old, Guangxu was thrust onto the dragon throne, becoming the nominal ruler of over 400 million people, while his aunt pulled the strings from behind the scenes. Awu. For the next 20 years, Cixi shaped every aspect of Guangxu's life. She chose his tutors, his advisors, his daily schedule, even the books he was allowed to read. The young emperor grew up knowing that his aunt's word was law, that challenging her meant losing everything. He was intelligent, curious about foreign ideas, and genuinely wanted to reform China's struggling government. But every time he showed independence, Cixi would remind him who really held power. The ultimate demonstration of her control came in 1889, when Cixi announced that the 20-year-old emperor would marry her niece, Jingfen. This wasn't just any political marriage. This was Guangxu's first cousin, the daughter of Cixi's own brother. The message was clear: even in marriage, the emperor would remain within Cixi's family circle, ensuring that her bloodline would continue to dominate the imperial court. Guangxu was horrified. He had never been allowed to choose anything for himself, but marriage felt like the one area where he might have some say. He had quietly hoped to marry for love, or at least to choose someone he found compatible. Instead, he was being forced to marry a woman who was essentially his sister, selected not for her beauty or intelligence, but for her ability to serve as Cixi spy in the emperor's most private moments. The wedding preparations became a nightmare for the young emperor. Court records from this period reveal his growing desperation as the ceremony approached. He barely ate, couldn't sleep, and began showing signs of what modern psychologists would recognize as severe depression. His tutors noted that he seemed to age years in a matter of months, his youthful optimism replaced by a haunted resignation. Jingfen, for her part, was equally trapped. She had been raised knowing that her entire purpose was to serve her aunt's political ambitions. At 22, she was older than Guangxu and had been thoroughly trained in the arts of manipulation and surveillance. She understood that her marriage wasn't about love or even companionship. It was about maintaining her family's grip on power. The wedding ceremony in 1889 was a lavish spectacle that masked the horror of what was actually happening. Thousands of guests filled the Forbidden City, watching as the emperor and his cousin bride went through the ancient rituals that would bind them together. But observers noted something chilling about the proceedings. The emperor moved like a man in a trance, his eyes vacant, his responses mechanical. When he placed the ceremonial phoenix crown on Jingfen's head, his hands shook so violently that attendants had to help him complete the gesture. The wedding night was a disaster that would haunt both participants for the rest of their lives. Palace records discovered centuries later reveal that Guangxu was so traumatized by the forced intimacy with his cousin that he became physically ill. He spent the following weeks in seclusion, refusing to see anyone except his personal physician. When he finally emerged, courtiers noted that something fundamental had changed in him. The curious, hopeful young man was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to have died inside. But Cixi's manipulation didn't end with the wedding. She also selected 2 additional wives for Guangxu, sisters named Jin and Zhen, who were also her relatives. The emperor found himself trapped in a household of women who all reported his every move back to his aunt. His private conversations were monitored, his correspondence was read, and his most intimate moments were analyzed for signs of disloyalty to Cixi's regime. The psychological impact on Guangxu was devastating. He began to retreat further into himself, spending hours alone in his study, reading foreign books about constitutional monarchy and democratic reforms. These books became his escape from a reality that had become unbearable. He dreamed of transforming China into a modern nation, but he knew that any attempt at reform would be crushed by his aunt's iron grip on power. The most heartbreaking aspect of Guangxu's story is how his forced marriage destroyed his capacity for normal human relationships. He became suspicious of everyone around him, unable to trust even his closest advisors. His relationship with his cousin wife deteriorated into cold formality, with both parties going through the motions of royal protocol while maintaining emotional distance. The intimacy that should have been the foundation of their marriage became a source of mutual revulsion and shame. Guangxu did eventually find some comfort with his third wife, Zhen, but even this relationship was tainted by the circumstances of their marriage. He knew that she, like all his wives, had been chosen by Cixi to serve her purposes. Every moment of affection was shadowed by the knowledge that it might be reported back to his aunt, analyzed for political significance, and used against him if necessary. The Chinese imperial court wasn't alone in this practice. Across the world, other royal families were conducting similar experiments in genetic and psychological destruction. The Spanish Habsburg dynasty became particularly notorious for forcing their heirs into marriages with aunts, nieces, and cousins. The results were catastrophic, creating generations of rulers who were physically deformed, mentally unstable, and completely incapable of governing effectively. King Philip IV of Spain provides another chilling example of how these forced marriages destroyed lives. When his first wife died in 1644, leaving him without a male heir, Philip faced a succession crisis that threatened the entire Spanish Empire. His solution was as brutal as it was logical. He would marry his 14-year-old niece, Mariana of Austria, who had originally been engaged to his deceased son. The arrangement was monstrous in its calculation. Philip was 44 years old, 3 decades older than his bride. Mariana was the daughter of his own sister, making their union not just politically convenient, but genetically dangerous. Yet the marriage proceeded with full royal ceremony, blessed by the Pope himself after Philip threatened to abandon the Holy League's fight against the Ottoman Empire. The wedding night was a trauma that would define both their lives. Mariana, barely more than a child, was expected to immediately begin producing heirs for the Spanish throne. The physical and psychological violence of this expectation cannot be overstated. She was a terrified teenager being forced into intimate relations with a man old enough to be her father, a man who was also her uncle, a man who saw her not as a person but as a breeding vessel for the continuation of his bloodline. The pregnancies that followed were disasters. Mariana endured multiple miscarriages, each one adding to her trauma and Philip's frustration. When she finally gave birth to a son who survived infancy, the child was so severely damaged by the genetic consequences of incest that he could barely function as a human being, let alone as a king. Charles II, their son, became known as the Bewitched because of his physical deformities and mental incapacity. But the true horror of these marriages wasn't just the genetic damage they caused, it was the psychological destruction they inflicted on their victims. These princes and princesses were taught from birth that their only value lay in their ability to serve their family's political ambitions. They were raised to believe that their personal desires, their dreams of love and companionship, were irrelevant compared to the needs of the dynasty. The isolation was perhaps the most crushing aspect of their experience. They were surrounded by courtiers and servants, yet they had no one they could truly trust. Every person in their lives had been placed there for political reasons. Every relationship was tainted by the knowledge that it served some larger purpose. They lived in golden cages, envied by millions for their wealth and power, yet emotionally starved and psychologically broken. The princes forced into these marriages often developed coping mechanisms that would be familiar to modern trauma survivors. Some retreated into books and learning, using intellectual pursuits to escape from their unbearable reality. Others turned to alcohol, drugs, or other forms of self-medication. Many became paranoid and suspicious, unable to form normal relationships even with those who genuinely cared for them. The princesses who were forced to marry their uncles, nephews, or cousins faced additional horrors. They were expected to submit not just politically but sexually to men who were often old enough to be their fathers or young enough to be their sons. They had to endure pregnancies that were dangerous both genetically and medically, knowing that their value as human beings was measured entirely by their ability to produce healthy male heirs. The system created a cycle of abuse that stretched across generations. Children born of these incestuous unions often grew up to perpetuate the same practices, having been raised to believe that marrying within the family was not just normal but necessary. They couldn't imagine any other way of life because they had never been exposed to healthy relationship models. What makes these stories even more tragic is how the victims often blamed themselves for their suffering. They had been taught that their bloodline was sacred, that their family's political needs were more important than their personal happiness. When they felt revulsion at being forced to marry their relatives, they interpreted this as a personal failing rather than a natural human response to an unnatural situation. The psychological damage wasn't limited to the immediate victims. The entire court system became twisted around these arrangements, with nobles and officials learning to participate in and enable the abuse. They developed elaborate justifications for practices they knew were wrong, creating a culture of complicity that made reform nearly impossible. The doctors and advisors who witnessed these forced marriages understood the human cost, but they were trapped in a system that punished honesty about royal dysfunction. Medical records from various courts reveal physicians documenting the physical and mental deterioration of princes forced into incestuous marriages, but these reports were carefully coded to avoid direct criticism of royal practices. They wrote about melancholy, nervous conditions, and constitutional weakness when they really meant trauma, depression, and the visible effects of genetic damage. The economic machinery of these empires depended on maintaining the fiction that royal bloodlines were blessed by divine providence. Admitting that forcing princes to marry their aunts created damaged, incompetent rulers would have undermined the entire justification for monarchical power. So the truth was buried beneath layers of ceremony, protocol, and carefully crafted propaganda that portrayed these marriages as romantic unions between divinely chosen partners. The religious establishment played a crucial role in legitimizing these horrors. The Catholic Church, despite biblical prohibitions against such close relationships, regularly granted dispensations for royal incest when presented with sufficient political pressure. Pope after pope wrestled with the moral implications of blessing marriages between uncles and nieces, yet they consistently chose political expediency over human welfare. The justifications became increasingly elaborate, with church theologians developing complex arguments about how royal bloodlines operated under different moral rules than ordinary families. The psychological manipulation began long before the actual wedding ceremonies. Young princes were systematically isolated from normal social relationships, preventing them from developing healthy models of love and companionship. They were surrounded by tutors and companions who had been carefully selected for their loyalty to the royal family's political objectives, rather than their ability to nurture healthy emotional development. Consider the case of Prince Ferdinand of Austria, who was informed at age 15 that he would marry his aunt, Archduchess Maria Theresa. The announcement came during what should have been a celebration of his academic achievements. Ferdinand had excelled in his studies, showing particular aptitude for languages and military strategy. His tutors reported that he was developing into a thoughtful, capable young man who might one day become an effective ruler. But the marriage announcement changed everything. Ferdinand's personality began to shift almost immediately. He became withdrawn, suspicious, and prone to violent outbursts that terrified his servants. His academic performance plummeted as he struggled to concentrate on anything other than his approaching doom. Letters from this period, discovered in palace archives, reveal a young man desperately seeking some way to escape his fate. "I cannot bear the thought of what awaits me," he wrote to a cousin in a letter that was intercepted by palace security. "She who should be my protector has become my destroyer. I would rather die in battle than endure this living death." The letter never reached its intended recipient, but it was preserved in the files of the court's intelligence service, a reminder of how thoroughly these young people were monitored and controlled. The wedding preparations became a form of psychological torture. Ferdinand was required to participate in elaborate ceremonies celebrating his upcoming marriage, forced to smile and appear grateful for an arrangement that was destroying his sanity. He had to endure fittings for wedding clothes, rehearsals for the ceremony, and public appearances where he was expected to display affection for his aunt bride. The most insidious aspect of this preparation was how it normalized the abnormal. Ferdinand was surrounded by courtiers who spoke of his marriage as if it were completely ordinary, as if marrying one's aunt were no different from any other royal union. This gaslighting was deliberate. By treating the arrangement as normal, his handlers made it impossible for Ferdinand to articulate his objections without appearing ungrateful or mentally unstable. The physical preparation was equally traumatic. Ferdinand was subjected to medical examinations designed to ensure his fitness for producing heirs, procedures that violated his bodily autonomy in ways that would be recognized as abuse today. Court physicians documented his physical development with clinical detachment, treating him like breeding stock rather than a human being with dignity and rights. Meanwhile, his aunt bride was undergoing her own psychological preparation. Maria Theresa, at 32, was old enough to understand the political calculations behind their marriage. She had been raised to believe that her primary value lay in her ability to produce male heirs, and she approached the marriage with the resigned determination of someone who had never been allowed to hope for anything better. The age difference added another layer of horror to their situation. Ferdinand was still developing emotionally and physically, while Maria Theresa was a mature woman who had already experienced the disappointments and compromises of adult life. Their relationship was inherently unequal, with Ferdinand cast in the role of both nephew and husband, creating a dynamic that was psychologically damaging for both parties. The wedding ceremony itself was a masterpiece of royal pageantry designed to obscure the human suffering at its center. Thousands of guests filled the cathedral watching as Ferdinand and Maria Theresa exchanged vows that bound them together in ways that violated every natural instinct about family relationships. The young prince moved through the ceremony like a sleepwalker, his responses barely audible, his face a mask of barely controlled panic. Contemporary accounts describe the reception as a surreal affair, where guests celebrated while carefully avoiding any direct acknowledgement of the unusual nature of the union. Diplomats from foreign courts sent detailed reports back to their masters, describing the ceremony with the kind of clinical fascination usually reserved for exotic cultural practices. They understood they were witnessing something historically significant, but they couldn't quite bring themselves to name the horror they were observing. The wedding night marked the beginning of Ferdinand's complete psychological collapse. Palace records from the following weeks describe a young man who had essentially ceased to function. He stopped eating regularly, couldn't sleep, and began showing signs of what modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe dissociative episodes. His personal servants reported finding him standing motionless for hours, staring at nothing, completely unresponsive to attempts at communication. The forced intimacy with his aunt created a form of trauma that Ferdinand's mind couldn't process. He had been raised to revere Maria Theresa as a maternal figure, someone who represented authority and protection. Now he was expected to relate to her as a wife and sexual partner, a psychological impossibility that his mind resolved by essentially shutting down. Maria Theresa, for her part, was dealing with her own trauma. She had to maintain the fiction that their marriage was normal while experiencing the daily reality of its psychological violence. She was expected to be patient with Ferdinand's obvious distress, while also fulfilling her duties as a wife and future mother. The strain of maintaining this impossible balance began to show in her own behavior, as she became increasingly rigid and controlling in her interactions with court staff. The broader court system adapted to accommodate Ferdinand's dysfunction by essentially removing him from any meaningful decision-making processes. His advisors learned to interpret his barely coherent instructions. His personal staff developed elaborate routines to manage his unpredictable behavior, and the entire machinery of government learned to function around a ruler who was present in body but absent in spirit. The most tragic aspect of Ferdinand's story is how his suffering was used to justify the very system that had created it. Court propaganda portrayed his obvious distress as evidence of his deep spiritual nature, his inability to function normally as proof of his otherworldly wisdom. His breakdown was reframed as a form of divine inspiration, allowing the system to maintain its legitimacy while continuing to destroy the lives of those it claimed to serve. The genetic consequences of these forced marriages were becoming increasingly obvious by the 18th century, but the political machinery was too entrenched to change course. Royal families had invested centuries in building their legitimacy around the concept of bloodline purity, and abandoning that principle would have required admitting that their entire system was built on a lie. The children born of these unions carried the accumulated genetic damage of generations of incest, but they also bore the psychological scars of parents who had been traumatized by their own forced marriages. These children grew up in households where normal family relationships had been completely distorted, where the concepts of love, trust, and emotional safety had been subordinated to political necessity. The cycle perpetuated itself because the victims of the system often became its most ardent defenders. Having sacrificed their own happiness for the supposed good of their families, they couldn't acknowledge that their sacrifice had been meaningless without admitting that their entire lives had been wasted. They continued to arrange similar marriages for their own children, convincing themselves that they were preserving something sacred rather than perpetuating a system of abuse. The international diplomatic community was complicit in maintaining these arrangements because they provided stability and predictability in an otherwise chaotic political environment. Foreign ambassadors might privately express distaste for the practice of royal incest, but they continued to negotiate treaties and trade agreements that depended on the continuity these marriages were supposed to provide. The true cost of these forced marriages extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire societies that were governed by traumatized, dysfunctional rulers. The princes who were forced to marry their aunts often became paranoid, cruel, and incompetent leaders who made disastrous decisions that affected millions of subjects. The system that was supposed to preserve strong dynasties instead created weak, unstable governments that were vulnerable to revolution and collapse. The psychological damage was intergenerational, creating patterns of dysfunction that persisted long after the original victims had died. Children who grew up witnessing the hollow marriages of their parents learned to view relationships as transactions rather than sources of emotional fulfillment. They developed attachment disorders, trust issues, and distorted views of intimacy that affected their ability to form healthy relationships throughout their lives. The medical establishment of the time was complicit in maintaining these arrangements by providing pseudoscientific justifications for practices they knew were harmful. Court physicians developed elaborate theories about royal bloodlines and genetic superiority that masked the obvious evidence of the damage caused by incest. They treated the symptoms of trauma and genetic disorders while carefully avoiding any discussion of their actual causes. The educational system that surrounded these princes was designed to prevent them from developing the critical thinking skills that might have allowed them to question their circumstances. They were taught to view their family's practices as sacred traditions rather than harmful customs, to see their suffering as noble sacrifice rather than pointless abuse. Their tutors were selected for their loyalty to the royal family rather than their commitment to honest education. The isolation was so complete that many of these princes had no concept of what normal family relationships looked like. They had never witnessed healthy marriages, never seen examples of genuine affection between spouses, never experienced the security that comes from being loved unconditionally. Their entire understanding of human relationships was shaped by the distorted dynamics of their own families. The resistance that did emerge was quickly and brutally suppressed. Princes who refused to participate in arranged marriages faced imprisonment, exile, or worse. Their stories were erased from official histories, their names struck from family records, their very existence denied by the systems they had dared to challenge. The few who managed to escape often found themselves unable to function in the outside world, their psychological damage too severe to overcome. The religious and philosophical justifications for these practices became increasingly elaborate as their harmful effects became more obvious. Theologians developed complex arguments about the special nature of royal bloodlines. Philosophers created theories about the necessity of sacrifice for the greater good, and artists produced works that romanticized the suffering of those who gave up personal happiness for political duty. The economic interests that supported these arrangements were vast and interconnected. Entire industries depended on the stability that royal marriages were supposed to provide. Merchants, bankers, and manufacturers had investments that were tied to the continuity of particular dynasties. The human cost of maintaining these systems was considered acceptable collateral damage in the pursuit of economic prosperity. The diplomatic protocols that governed international relations were built around the assumption that royal marriages would continue to serve as the foundation for political alliances. Treaties were negotiated on the understanding that future generations would honor the commitments made by their predecessors through marriage. The entire structure of European politics depended on the willingness of young princes to sacrifice themselves for the supposed good of their nations. The propaganda machine that supported these forced marriages was sophisticated and pervasive, reaching into every aspect of society to normalize what should have been recognized as systematic abuse. Court artists were commissioned to create romantic paintings of uncle-niece weddings. Poets wrote verses celebrating the purity of bloodline marriages, and historians crafted narratives that portrayed these unions as divinely ordained love stories. The truth was buried beneath layers of artistic beauty and literary eloquence that made the horror palatable to those who witnessed it. The selection process for these marriages was coldly calculated, with royal advisors maintaining detailed records of which family members possessed the most desirable genetic and political traits. They created elaborate family trees that mapped out the most advantageous combinations, treating human beings like breeding stock in a carefully managed genetic experiment. The young princes had no say in these calculations. They were simply assets to be deployed according to the strategic needs of their families. The timing of these announcements was deliberately chosen to maximize psychological impact and minimize resistance. Princes were often informed of their marriage arrangements during moments of vulnerability, after the death of a parent, during periods of political crisis, or when they were isolated from potential supporters. The shock was intended to break down their psychological defenses and make them more compliant with their family's demands. The preparation period before these weddings became a form of systematic psychological conditioning designed to break down the natural resistance that any healthy person would feel toward marrying a close relative. Princes were subjected to intensive religious instruction that emphasized their duty to preserve their bloodline, philosophical education that portrayed personal sacrifice as the highest form of nobility, and social conditioning that made questioning their family's decisions seem like betrayal. The involvement of foreign courts in these arrangements added another layer of political complexity that made escape even more difficult. When a prince was forced to marry his aunt, it wasn't just a domestic family matter. It often involved international treaties, trade agreements, and military alliances that multiple governments had invested years in negotiating. The personal suffering of one young man was considered insignificant compared to the political benefits that his marriage would provide to entire nations. The documentation of these marriages reveals a pattern of systematic dehumanization that was remarkably consistent across different cultures and time periods. Whether in China, Spain, Austria, or other royal courts, the same techniques were used to break down resistance and force compliance. The victims were isolated from potential supporters, subjected to intensive propaganda, and gradually stripped of their ability to conceive of any alternative to their assigned fate. The medical examinations that preceded these marriages were particularly traumatic, involving intimate physical inspections that violated the prince's bodily autonomy in ways that would be recognized as sexual abuse today. Court physicians documented every aspect of their physical development, creating detailed records that treated these young men like laboratory specimens rather than human beings with dignity and rights. The wedding ceremonies themselves were carefully choreographed performances designed to create the illusion of voluntary participation while actually demonstrating the complete powerlessness of the participants. Every gesture, every word, every facial expression was scripted and rehearsed until the princes learned to perform their own subjugation with convincing enthusiasm. The pageantry was so elaborate that observers often missed the subtle signs of distress that revealed the true nature of what they were witnessing. The aftermath of these weddings was consistently devastating, with detailed court records documenting the psychological collapse of prince after prince who had been forced into these arrangements. The patterns were remarkably similar. Initial shock and denial, followed by attempts at resistance, then gradual withdrawal and dissociation as the reality of their situation became undeniable. Many never recovered from the trauma, spending the rest of their lives as hollow shells of their former selves. The impact on the women who were forced to marry their nephews was equally severe, though it was often overlooked by historians who focused primarily on the male victims. These women faced their own unique forms of trauma, having to navigate the complex psychological dynamics of being both aunt and wife, authority figure, and sexual partner. The confusion and shame they experienced was compounded by their complete lack of agency in the situation. The children born of these unions carried the accumulated psychological damage of multiple generations, creating patterns of dysfunction that persisted long after the original victims had died. Court records describe children who grew up unable to form normal attachments, who displayed disturbing behaviors that mystified their caregivers, and who often perpetuated the same patterns of abuse when they reached adulthood. The international diplomatic community was fully aware of the human cost of these arrangements, but they continued to support them because they provided stability and predictability in an otherwise chaotic political environment. Ambassadors wrote detailed reports describing the obvious suffering of the princes involved, but these reports were filed away and forgotten as governments prioritized political convenience over human welfare. The resistance that did emerge was quickly and brutally suppressed, with princes who refused to participate in arranged marriages facing imprisonment, exile, or worse. Their stories were systematically erased from official histories, their names struck from family records, their very existence denied by the systems they had dared to challenge. The few who managed to escape often found themselves unable to function in the outside world, their psychological damage too severe to overcome. The religious justifications for these practices became increasingly elaborate as their harmful effects became more obvious. Church leaders developed complex theological arguments about the special nature of royal bloodlines, claiming that normal moral rules didn't apply to those who had been chosen by God to rule. These arguments provided a veneer of respectability to practices that violated every natural instinct about family relationships and human dignity. The economic interests that supported these arrangements were vast and interconnected, with entire industries depending on the stability that royal marriages were supposed to provide. Merchants, bankers, and manufacturers had investments that were tied to the continuity of particular dynasties, making them complicit in maintaining a system that they knew was destroying human lives. The economic benefits were considered more important than the psychological welfare of the individuals involved. The educational system that surrounded these princes was designed to prevent them from developing the critical thinking skills that might have allowed them to question their circumstances. They were taught to view their family's practices as sacred traditions rather than harmful customs, to see their suffering as noble sacrifice rather than pointless abuse. Their tutors were selected for their loyalty to the royal family rather than their commitment to honest education. The isolation was so complete that many of these princes had no concept of what normal family relationships looked like. They had never witnessed healthy marriages, never seen examples of genuine affection between spouses, never experienced the security that comes from being loved unconditionally. Their entire understanding of human relationships was shaped by the distorted dynamics of their own families. The propaganda that supported these marriages was remarkably sophisticated, using every available medium to normalize what should have been recognized as systematic abuse. Court artists created romantic paintings of uncle-niece weddings, poets wrote verses celebrating the purity of bloodline marriages, and historians crafted narratives that portrayed these unions as divinely ordained love stories. The truth was buried beneath layers of artistic beauty and literary eloquence. The medical establishment of the time was complicit in maintaining these arrangements by providing pseudoscientific justifications for practices they knew were harmful. Court physicians developed elaborate theories about royal bloodlines and genetic superiority that masked the obvious evidence of the damage caused by incest. They treated the symptoms of trauma and genetic disorders while carefully avoiding any discussion of their actual causes. The diplomatic protocols that governed international relations were built around the assumption that royal marriages would continue to serve as the foundation for political alliances. Treaties were negotiated on the understanding that future generations would honor the commitments made by their predecessors through marriage. The entire structure of European politics depended on the willingness of young princes to sacrifice themselves for the supposed good of their nations. The psychological techniques used to break down resistance were remarkably consistent across different cultures and time periods. Princes were subjected to intensive religious instruction that emphasized their duty to preserve their bloodline, philosophical education that portrayed personal sacrifice as the highest form of nobility, and social conditioning that made questioning their family's decisions seem like betrayal. The timing of these marriage announcements was deliberately chosen to maximize psychological impact and minimize resistance. Princes were often informed of their arrangements during moments of vulnerability, after the death of a parent, during periods of political crisis, or when they were isolated from potential supporters. The shock was intended to break down their psychological defenses and make them more compliant with their family's demands. The preparation period before these weddings became a form of systematic conditioning, designed to normalize what should have been recognized as abuse. Princes were gradually introduced to the idea of marrying their aunts through carefully orchestrated conversations, religious ceremonies, and social events that made the arrangement seem increasingly inevitable and acceptable. The involvement of multiple generations in these arrangements created a complex web of complicity that made resistance nearly impossible. Grandparents, parents, siblings, and extended family members all participated in maintaining the fiction that these marriages were normal and beneficial. The princes found themselves surrounded by people who claimed to love them while simultaneously participating in their destruction. The documentation of these marriages reveals a pattern of systematic dehumanization that was remarkably consistent across different royal courts. The victims were treated like valuable objects rather than human beings, their worth measured entirely by their ability to produce heirs and maintain political alliances. Their personal desires, dreams, and emotional needs were considered irrelevant compared to the strategic benefits their marriages would provide. The international nature of these arrangements meant that escape was virtually impossible. When a prince was forced to marry his aunt, it wasn't just a domestic family matter. It often involved multiple governments, international treaties, and complex diplomatic agreements that made any change in plans politically catastrophic. The personal suffering of one young man was considered insignificant compared to the potential disruption his resistance might cause to carefully negotiated international relationships. The psychological damage inflicted by these forced marriages extended far beyond the immediate victims to encompass entire societies that were governed by traumatized, dysfunctional rulers. The princes who were forced to marry their aunts often became paranoid, cruel, and incompetent leaders who made disastrous decisions that affected millions of subjects. The system that was supposed to preserve strong dynasties instead created weak, unstable governments that were vulnerable to revolution and collapse. The most insidious aspect of these arrangements was how they were presented as acts of love and devotion, rather than what they actually were. Systematic abuse designed to maintain political power. The victims were told that their sacrifice was noble, that their suffering served a higher purpose, that their personal happiness was less important than the welfare of their families and nations. This psychological manipulation made it difficult for them to recognize the true nature of their situation and even harder to resist. The most devastating aspect of these forced marriages was how they destroyed the victim's ability to conceive of any alternative future. These princes had been so thoroughly conditioned to believe that their personal desires were irrelevant that they often participated in their own destruction with heartbreaking compliance. They would stand at altars, exchanging vows with their aunts while tears streamed down their faces, genuinely believing that their suffering was necessary for some greater good. The aftermath of these weddings was universally catastrophic. Court physicians documented case after case of princes who suffered complete psychological breakdowns within weeks of their forced marriages. They would retreat into themselves, becoming unable to perform even basic royal duties. Some developed what we would now recognize as severe dissociative disorders, existing in a state of emotional numbness that allowed them to function mechanically while their spirits withered away. The children born of these unions carried the accumulated trauma of generations, creating dynasties of damaged individuals who perpetuated the same destructive patterns. Palace records describe children who grew up unable to form normal attachments, who displayed disturbing behaviors that mystified their caregivers, and who often became the architects of their own descendants' suffering when they reached positions of power. The system's defenders developed increasingly elaborate justifications as the evidence of its destructiveness became undeniable. They claimed that the suffering of these princes was evidence of their spiritual refinement, that their obvious distress proved they were too pure for this world, that their inability to function normally was actually a sign of divine favor. These twisted interpretations allowed the system to maintain its legitimacy while continuing to destroy the lives of those it claimed to serve. The international diplomatic community was fully aware of the human cost, but continued to support these arrangements because they provided the stability that made trade and treaties possible. Ambassadors wrote detailed reports describing the obvious suffering of the princes involved, but these reports were filed away and forgotten as governments prioritized political convenience over human welfare. The resistance that did emerge was swiftly and brutally crushed. Princes who refused to marry their aunts faced imprisonment, exile, or mysterious deaths that were officially attributed to illness or accident. Their stories were systematically erased from historical records, their names struck from family trees, their very existence denied by the systems they had dared to challenge. The few who managed to escape often found themselves unable to function in the outside world, their psychological damage too severe to overcome. The religious establishment played a crucial role in legitimizing these horrors, providing theological justifications that made the unthinkable seem divinely ordained. Church leaders developed complex arguments about the special nature of royal bloodlines, claiming that normal moral rules didn't apply to those chosen by God to rule. These arguments provided a veneer of respectability to practices that violated every natural instinct about family relationships and human dignity. The economic machinery that supported these arrangements was vast and interconnected. Entire industries depended on the political stability that royal marriages were supposed to provide. Merchants, bankers, and manufacturers had investments tied to the continuity of particular dynasties, making them complicit in maintaining a system they knew was destroying human lives. The economic benefits were considered more important than the psychological welfare of the individuals involved. What makes these historical accounts so chilling is how they reveal the capacity of human societies to normalize the most extreme forms of abuse when it serves their interests. The forced marriage of princes to their aunts wasn't hidden or secret. It was celebrated with elaborate ceremonies, documented in official records, and praised in contemporary literature as evidence of royal devotion to duty. The propaganda machine that supported these marriages was remarkably sophisticated, using every available medium to present systematic abuse as romantic destiny. Court artists created beautiful paintings of uncle-niece weddings, poets wrote verses celebrating the purity of bloodline marriages, and historians crafted narratives that portrayed these unions as divinely ordained love stories. The truth was buried beneath layers of artistic beauty and literary eloquence that made the horror palatable to those who witnessed it. The medical establishment provided pseudoscientific justifications for practices they knew were harmful. Court physicians developed elaborate theories about royal bloodlines and genetic superiority that masked the obvious evidence of damage caused by incest. They treated the symptoms of trauma and genetic disorders while carefully avoiding any discussion of their actual causes, becoming complicit in maintaining a system that violated their oath to do no harm. The educational system surrounding these princes was designed to prevent them from developing the critical thinking skills that might have allowed them to question their circumstances. They were taught to view their family's practices as sacred traditions rather than harmful customs, to see their suffering as noble sacrifice rather than pointless abuse. Their tutors were selected for loyalty to the royal family rather than commitment to honest education. The isolation was so complete that many of these princes had no concept of what normal family relationships looked like. They had never witnessed healthy marriages, never seen examples of genuine affection between spouses, never experienced the security that comes from being loved unconditionally. Their entire understanding of human relationships was shaped by the distorted dynamics of their own families. The psychological techniques used to break down resistance were remarkably consistent across different cultures and time periods. Princes were subjected to intensive religious instruction, emphasizing their duty to preserve their bloodline, philosophical education portraying personal sacrifice as the highest form of nobility, and social conditioning that made questioning their family's decisions seem like betrayal. The most tragic aspect of these stories is how they reveal the human capacity for both infinite cruelty and remarkable resilience. Even in the most desperate circumstances, some of these princes found ways to preserve fragments of their humanity. They wrote secret letters, created hidden artwork, or found small moments of genuine connection that sustained them through their darkest hours. The legacy of these forced marriages extends far beyond the immediate victims, to encompass entire societies that were governed by traumatized, dysfunctional rulers. The princes who were forced to marry their aunts often became paranoid, cruel, and incompetent leaders who made disastrous decisions affecting millions of subjects. The system that was supposed to preserve strong dynasties instead created weak, unstable governments, vulnerable to revolution and collapse. Today, we look back on these practices with horror, unable to understand how entire civilizations could participate in such systematic abuse. But the forces that enabled these tragedies, the willingness to sacrifice individual welfare for political expediency, the tendency to normalize abuse when it serves powerful interests, the capacity for elaborate self-deception in the face of obvious suffering. These forces still exist in our world today. The princes forced to marry their aunts remind us that behind every political system, no matter how grand or sophisticated, lie individual human beings whose lives can be destroyed by those who wield power without conscience. Their stories serve as a warning about the dangers of allowing political considerations to override basic human decency, and as a tribute to the resilience of the human spirit, even in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. Their voices, silenced by death and deliberately erased by history, still echo across the centuries with a simple, profound message. Remember us not as political symbols or historical curiosities, but as human beings who deserved better than the fate that politics and genetics conspired to give us. Remember us and ensure that such systematic cruelty is never again disguised as noble tradition or political necessity. In the end, these tragic stories remind us that the price of political power, when measured in human suffering, is always too high. The princes who were forced to marry their aunts paid that price with their lives, their sanity, and their souls, a cost that no political system, no matter how grand its ambitions, should ever demand from those it claims to serve.